He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone.
Well, hello. Islands at War here. We're at November 1940 already. I'm Keith Pengelly, and here with me, of course, as ever, Nick Lahure. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Keith. How are you doing?
Not so bad. Well, November 1940 already, and lots to cover off in this very, very busy month. As usual, we'll just give a little explanation of what we're doing. Nick and I are we're locally born Guernseymen. We're very interested in the occupation of Guernsey, both the military aspects and also the civilian affairs aspects. Now, we, as I say, are at November 1940. We seek to cover every month off. There's always something going on, and some events sort of span the months. So later on, we'll be catching up with the aftermath of two spies that came ashore, which would be Hubert Nicolle and James Symes, and the fallout from that. Lots of different other things to dive into. So, Nick, we'll start off with social and civilian affairs. The Germans had prohibited fishermen to leave the various ports here and fish in local waters. In November 1940, the Reverend Ord, in his wonderful diaries, records that fishermen were able to resume fishing from St Sampson's and St Peter Port.
Yeah, so the fishing had been stopped in September 1940 following an escape of 8 Guernseymen who successfully got away to the UK from Bordeaux Harbour, which for those of you that are not local and listening is a small sort of harbour with generally fishing boats, a few pleasure boats, and was pretty much the same, I think, at that period in time. After they escaped, the Germans basically said all boats are to cease sailing, no fishing whatsoever. In fact, they took a large quantity of the boats to St Peter Port, and they were all up on land. Now, this turned out to be a pretty silly thing to do when you're on an island and you are, as we've talked about in the past, reliant on imports for your food, because you just simply cannot feed everyone with stuff that you can grow. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And fish was one of the main, things that people would eat, because it was plentiful. You go out in your boat and catch some fish. So it soon dawned on them that, well, actually this is not a very good idea. And they did allow fishing again, but you had to have a permit. Quite often you had a German on your boat, or if you didn't have a German on your boat with you, there were other boats which were patrolling and making sure nobody disappeared.
Yes, we should point out that these are not big fishing trawlers. They're the boats of the same size today we see around the island, and they would be catching mackerel and flatfish, etc., but also shellfish, lobster, crab, and the occasional crayfish. So it wasn't a huge fleet of boats that were organised. These are individual local men that probably had a proper job, but also went fishing. There wasn't too many dedicated fishing, but everything helped, didn't it?
Yeah, and the type of boat you're looking at is probably something up to about 20 feet long. Some were slightly smaller. They're open, often had a sail, and some of them had engines, others not. There's a really good example, actually, if you go to the National Trust Museum at Sunray Park here in Guernsey. They've got one there outside of the museum, if you want to have a look and see what one of these boats looks like.
And also Richard Hume, I think, at the Guernsey Occupation Museum up near the airport. We'll probably, at the end of the programme, give a few more details about local associations and museums. But one of the boats outside the museum there was actually used in an escape, wasn't it? But it is a fishing boat.
Yeah, absolutely. It was used in an escape, and it was brought back after the war and continued to be used, I believe. It was until relatively recently. I think it was in the 2000s, something like that. I'll have to check on that, actually.
Yeah, and when you clap eyes on this boat, it's not very big. So anyway, as you say, boats were allowed to go out fishing again, often with a German soldier on board, probably bored to tears and more than a little seasick. But because the food situation was declining and deteriorating, even at this early phase in the war, there was also in November 1940, Nick, a census of land and gardens capable of cultivation.
Yes, and that was done purely for the same reason as the fishermen were allowed back out. There was a real need to cultivate as much food as possible on the islands. Otherwise, it meant having to ship it from France. So much like the fishing, it was just driven by the need for being able to try and have as much food locally as possible, particularly as the German ships were already being attacked by the RAF as they were coming across from France. Just going back to the point about the German being bored on the fishing boat, Guernsey people can be a bit stubborn and sometimes a little bit mischievous.
What?
I've seen plenty of accounts where Guernsey fishermen perhaps went fishing in areas where they might not have gone on that day with the wind in that direction if they were on their own on their boat, which, it made it a little bit choppy, very uncomfortable for anybody that's not used to being at sea. And they used to torment some of the German guards. You can imagine it. Some farmer boy from Bavaria suddenly finds himself at the foot of some cliffs and some pretty choppy water. Yeah. One can imagine. So, going back to the census of land and gardens capable of cultivation, of course, what they're looking to do is a sort of almost a dig for victory in a way, just making sure that all of the land that is able to support crops, and they would have been buying the seed, etc., in France, bringing that over and getting people to plant up where they could. Yeah, in particular potatoes, things like that. They as you say, they were acquiring seed in France. Sometimes they weren't getting the crops that they actually wanted, but they just had to go with what they could get. And throughout the occupation, one of the things that you notice as you read accounts is that people who didn't live in St. Petersburg in town, were slightly better off than those that lived in town because they had somewhere that they could actually grow some of their own crops, albeit there were strict rules about what they could do with them and how much they could keep for themselves, etc. But the people in town obviously had nowhere to supplement what they could get. No, and Guernsey, as we all know, well, most of us know, was synonymous with the growing of tomatoes. Now, the thing about growing of tomatoes, for the uninitiated, is that they're grown in Guernsey. Not now. The tomato industry is finished, but at the time it was a huge industry. And just because you can grow tomatoes, it doesn't mean to say necessarily you can grow anything else, especially in greenhouses. Now, we have mentioned this in the past, Nick. The room that we're actually recording in is an old packing shed, converted now to a studio. But there was a vinery on my property, Friesland Vinery, still called that, on my rents and rates. And the grower here, Alfred John Lepedvin, now he would have been growing tomatoes into the 1940. I know he became ill and died in 1942, but in our archives, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, Nick, is actually his widow, Rachel Lepedvin. She had gone for some war reparations with the fact that they lost that first crop because the Germans used this place as a hub to collect the tomatoes, but you can only eat so many tomatoes. A diet of tomatoes is not recommended. And Rachel was able to claim £542 back in 1946-47 for the crop expenses that they lost in 1940. But we had this huge glut of tomatoes that would have been sent over to the United Kingdom. The Germans tried everything with them, but of course, this is just for local consumption. This was an enormous crop for export, and they had to dump them after a while and look towards growing
a much diminished tomato crop going forward for home consumption, but also to branch out into other areas. And think some things, people were trying to grow wheat and corn. They'd never, not in the greenhouses, but on their land, they'd never grown these things before. Yeah,
with varying success, because of course each different crop responds differently to the type of soil in that area. And one thing that some listeners may not be aware of is we have very different soil in different places around the island. Some of the lower lying coastal regions have very, very sandy soil, and it is very difficult to grow stuff even now in some of those areas. Yeah,
and I know the Germans sent over agricultural specialists that felt that local growers simply were not responding to German methods of farming, when of course these were people that are used to farming on an almost industrial scale, large farms in Germany, etc., and just thought these poor little islanders were stupid and couldn't grasp the fundamentals. But as you say, there was lots and lots of different soil types over on this small island, and there was a lack of expertise in some respects. Yeah. But if people were hungry, they'll try and make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, some of the Germans thought that the locals were actually doing it deliberately to sabotage
exactly.
the occupation. They couldn't believe that it wasn't possible for these things to be grown until they delved further into it and realised actually you just can't grow some of these crops not as effectively as you can elsewhere.
Yes, and the shortage of food we also see again from one of our sources, the diaries of Reverend Ord. He talks about tobacco rationing.
Yeah, tobacco was a big problem during the occupation. Even in November 1940, there was a shortage of tobacco, and there's an article. I'll dig it out, but in one of the editions of the Guernsey Press that I have from the occupation has an article which starts, "Sark can smoke again," because they've actually obtained a ration of tobacco for the people in Sark, which I thought was just an interesting little headline. There's a tiny little article that just explains about that. But yeah, they were rationing it, and later on in the occupation, they tried to make substitute tobacco by growing other crops and drying the leaves and stuff like that, with varying success.
Yeah, I knew a chap, he's passed now, a chap called Ron Sabia, who told me he lived in the same house right the way through his life. He was a sort of a Ebenezer LePage-Nick. His cottage is just by Vale Church there, and he told me he was trying to make tobacco from things like dried sunflower leaves. Yeah. And they say necessity, excuse me, is the mother of invention. And there were some quite ingenious things that worked, and there were some quite disingenuous things that didn't work. But there's a lot of thought went into trying to come up with ersatz tobacco.
Yeah, indeed. We'll perhaps talk about that a bit later when we get to some of the later months when things were starting to get a little bit more difficult on that front.
Okay, in November also, there was an order issued from senior officers or senior German administration in France about the sheltering of British subjects, not of Guernsey birth. So what we're referring to here is not combatants. These would have been people that were almost put it another way, almost exclusively English, that had come here to retire at the end of their careers, rather like going and living down in Bournemouth at one time. So these people would have seen themselves as being British citizens, of course, of English birth, and people, the Germans wanted to really, I suppose, quantify the amount of British subjects as opposed to Guernsey-born people on the island. And this of course, initiated the identity cards, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. They brought in identity cards in November 1940. You could go to various depots in your parish to get your identity card. Now, you had to be identified by two people when you were there to say, yes, that's definitely Keith. And again, liking a bit of mischief, there are reports in the newspapers of the time of well-known gentlemen going along, people that were well-known public faces in Guernsey that absolutely everybody would have known who they are, going along and sort of colluding to go along and pretend that nobody knew them at all at these ID parades, so that they'd have to go away, and it caused a bit of a fuss and a bit of inconvenience. They just pretend, no, sorry, don't know who that is. And I think there was quite a. They had very little to do at that time in terms of entertainment. So I think just being a little bit irritating was making up for that.
Yes, my grandmother. I had my grandmother's identity card. Was it you had to be over 16 to be photographed in November 14?
I think it was, yeah. I think it was 16.
Like
it was either 16 or 14, I can't remember.
Yeah, and my grandmother's card, were you able to put that on Facebook?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll give it to you after the programme.
Yeah, that's no problem.
One of the things that strikes me, of course, is already people are looking gaunt and stressed in these pictures, because one can go along to our archives and ask to see any of these pictures. You just pick a name and they will bring books out, and you can look at the government-owned cards that were taken. So obviously the government had a copy and then you had your own copy. And you can see the picture of my grandmother already. She's starting to look quite stressed out, quite worn down. And by the end of the war, you were able to see people's photographs on liberation and how they looked in 1940, the effects of malnutrition and all manner of hardships are apparent. But I'll give that to you later and we'll get that.
Yeah, absolutely, we can get that.
Yeah. Okay, so and I see also you've got some pictures of the identity parade and the way that it was being reported in local papers. We might be able to get that up as well.
Absolutely, not a problem.
Yep. Also, one of the things that the Germans had withdrawn very early on in the war, civilian cars and also buses and such like. And of course, this caused a great deal of hardship in people being able to get to work and go about their business, and they had no central transport. So again, you've got a really good clipping here, Civil Transport Service, and it begins on Monday, and we go into the fine detail. But essentially, just give us an overview of what happened and how they got around it.
So what they, as I was saying before we started recording, it's quite incredible that so few months into the occupation, and there's already a big problem with supplies of petrol, etc. So the bus service had stopped by this point, and they were to use vehicles for multiple purposes. So this civil transport is really an extension of what had been happening for tradesmen already for a few weeks, where they were having to use maybe one van, and it had the baker would put his stuff in to be delivered, the grocer would put stuff in to be delivered, etc. And this was kind of an extension of that, because the bus service had stopped. You pretty much, unless you were a doctor or similar, didn't have a car to be driving around in. So you were either on foot, on your horse, if you were lucky enough to have one, or on your pushang, your bicycle, or walking, to get around. So they started this system where they would have centralised transport, and the initial thing was they planned out that they had two buses that went to the forest, which is kind of centre of the island, up to the airport, because it was taking workmen up there who were being made to work on the airport, and it was available for use by civilians on the way back, effectively, so that it wasn't a wasted trip on the way back. But that's how they that's how they started to get around the transport problems. There'll be more of that coming up in December as well.
Yes, because not only was there a shortage of petrol, there was a shortage of bicycle repair kits and inner tubes and tyres, and I think people were tying hose pipes to the rims of their bicycles as a substitute for tyres. But of course, the other thing about travelling around the island under your own steam, if you are beginning to feel the effects of the lack of food, lack of vitamins, etc. To cycle. Guernsey's not all on the flat, as we know, and if someone in the town area needed to work in the higher parishes, it would have been difficult cycling around or walking around. From the sheer physicality of it, people were starting to get worn down, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other problem you've got to remember as well is it's all very well if you maybe have to walk, 2 hours to go and get to somewhere, to go and work or something like that. You've also got to walk 2 hours back, but you've got to factor in the fact there was a curfew as well. So
yes.
So you can't just take your time and meander back if you're going to do a full day's work and have to walk for 4 hours in total. Yeah, it's going to seriously curtail what you can do at work.
Yeah, so to follow up on for listeners on the notion of a curfew, this obviously we all know what a curfew is. However, it was backed up with military patrols, constant military patrols at night, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it was effective some of the time during the occupation. There are plenty of accounts where people got away with breaking it, but equally plenty of accounts where people ended up in court and getting chucked in prison or fined for breaking the curfew. So at this point in the war, the curfew started at 9:30 in the evening, or it was 9 o'clock in the evening in November 1940, and lasted until 6:30 in the morning. So you couldn't leave your house in between those hours.
Yeah, many years ago, over 50 years ago, he mumbles, one of my customers, when I was a lad, doing a paper round, was telling me that he had been, and we'll get onto this, I'd like to follow this up, Nick, not coerced, but co-opted into working for the Germans in some sort of clerical fashion. He could speak a bit of German, and what he was telling me was he sometimes had to go out during curfew, or be out whilst the curfew came down, both in the mornings and in the evenings, and he used to carry a pass. He had a pass. So, of course, when he saw the patrols, he would show his pass. After a while, he saw the patrols all the time. They knew who he was, and so they just nodded, and they sort of lifted up a hand and were like, yeah, okay, fine. Mm-hmm. So he said, I started walking around without my pass, until he said, because he lived in the St Martin's area, which is in the southwest of Guernsey. That area, of course, was taken over by Georgian troops. They stopped him. He couldn't produce the pass because he hadn't bothered taking it with him. And he told me he got very, very badly beaten up by them. So there was retribution one way or another. You could be fined for not having, for breaking curfew. And, of course, as this chap found out, you could be subject to rougher treatment as well. So you needed a pass to be out if you were working for the Germans. And otherwise, you didn't go out at all. And they changed the hours, didn't they? Like we went to German time, which was it was daylight until 10 o'clock or something like that. Is that right? Was it that way?
Yeah,
around?
probably around
dark till about 10 in the morning as well in the winter months. I see from some of the diaries.
Yeah, quite possibly. They definitely did change the time to German time. They just like controlling everything. Let's face facts. We've talked about that before. They liked to be in charge.
Yeah. One of the things that because I work in the tourism business, I suppose I'm an attendant for one of the museum sites, so I do talk to people and they do ask questions. A question came up this week about why Guernsey people were, in parenthesis, working for the Germans, but they had. This is not collaboration. This is not people volunteering to work for the Germans. We must be very clear about this. Essentially, as I understand it, Nick, the Germans say, we have a project, we need local labour. They went to our local government and said, basically, make it happen. So it was our local government that determined the labour force that went and worked for the Germans. This is not people applying for jobs that the Germans had. There was no I'd like to apply for this. You were told to do it, and that was the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Although the Germans did advertise for some things later, we'll get to that later on in the war. But it kind of backfired a little bit. But that's a story for another day. But yeah, generally speaking, they went along and to the local government and said, basically, you've got to produce 150 men to come and work on, the airport or down at the harbour and things like that. Now, it wasn't all one way when it came to the terms of that as well, because the after the air raids at the airport and some air raids at the harbour in St. Peterport, the men started demanding danger money.
Well, yes, I was going to get on to that, because the harbour and the airport were subject to Allied raids, Allied attack.
Yeah, they were. And they started demanding danger money, and the local government was, yeah, we think you should get this, and the Germans weren't very keen on danger money being paid. But in the end, it all got sorted out, and they did get their danger money. But actually, at one point in the war, they did withdraw labour from the airport completely for a period of time because it was deemed to be too dangerous. They were too worried about air raids. Yeah,
and local civilians, workmen, did get killed. There were fatalities as well.
Yeah, absolutely, at varying points throughout the war. Yeah.
We should probably again point out that, especially when we get into 1941 with the building of the Atlantic Wall, and we will get there in due course, but we did have labour that was brought into the island, and this is important for people to try and get their head round. Yes, there was slave labour, and this was poor unfortunates that had no choice whatsoever, predominantly Spaniards, I think, and Slavs, Poles, Czechs, etc. But we'll
come to that later on in the war.
And then there was the organisation Todd. Now these, again, we'll go into this in more detail. So we had another like labour battalion, but these people themselves were actually paid. So they're non-locals, not slaves. So you had slaves, organisation Todd, and then you did have local people where the Germans felt that there was a part to play, and local people got paid, of course, when they paid their taxes,
Yeah, it's quite a complex area covering who came from where and
who did what,
who was forced, who was a slave labour, who had volunteered, or who had been put in a similar position to that of the local workers, as in, if you don't go and do this, you won't get fed. You won't have any money. You won't, your family have got nothing to eat, and that was the stark reality of what faced the islanders. Was you either had to go and do these jobs or starve, or get sent to prison.
There wasn't there wasn't too many options, that's for sure. What I like to do now, Nick, is return to our sort of ongoing story, the aftermath of what happened to the people following the raid, the Commando raid, so called, by Hubert Nicolle and James Symes, both local men. They came to the island on an exploratory mission. We covered this in October 1940, and they had to surrender. Uniforms were found for them, so they could surrender in uniform. At various times, during their interrogation here, they were told they would be shot. Then they told they'd be fine. Then they were told they'd be shot, etc. But they surrendered in October 1940 and were sent as POWs to France and eventually on to Germany. However, this does not address what happened to the people that supported them whilst they were here. And it's we feel, Nick and I do feel, that we should name these people and pay tribute to the suffering and the fear they must have felt with Germans starting to turn up at their homes, take them to the local prison, interrogate them, and then they eventually went on to France and ended up in the how do we pronounce that, Nick?
Cherche Midi.
Cherche Midi in Paris, which became very, very infamous towards the end of the war, with resistance fighters being there, etc. However, in November 1940, we had the various people were transported over to France, and they must have been terrified. So in the first batch, there was a number of people that were taken to Paris via Dinan by air on the 8th of November. The people that were taken there were Emile Nicolle, who was Hubert's father, who was a senior civil servant, Frank Nicolle, Hubert's uncle, Louis Symes, which is James's father, Rachel Symes, James Symes' mother, Mary Bird, James' girlfriend, Jessie Mariette, who was Hubert's fiancée, Mary Bird's father, Wilfred, and also Mary's mother. So these people have been interrogated in Guernsey, sent on then to France. Now, there's some pictures of them before they left, Nick, and there's some pictures of them in Paris, I think at the Eiffel Tower. And they're actually there with their interrogator, a chap called Herr Lensch. So as we were preparing this programme, because as strange as it sounds, we do some preparation, I said to Nick, what have you got on Herr Lensch, this sort of shadowy chap, and thinking that Nick at less than 24 hours notice would be able to find nothing, but you found something on him.
Well, my initial reaction was, oh God, there's a lot of Lenches. Which, that was my initial problem. There were about 20 different hits that came up for that name, involved in the German occupation of the Channel Islands. So at the moment, I haven't been able to find out too much about him. I've got 2 or 3 possibilities. I've narrowed it down, and I will dig into that. But it could be quite interesting just to find out a little bit more about what happened to him. There's a possibility. Well, one of them certainly died on the Eastern Front, which I would say is probably a fairly high possibility. Is the one that we're looking for. But there were 2 others that survived the war. So I'll get back to you on that when we find out a little bit more about him. But it is a bizarre photograph. It's like a holiday photo that you take.
Or a sort of a photograph that like a bunch of teachers going to a college or something like this. And this guy, whether he said to them, "Can you smile for the camera?" Because these people are sort of giving these queasy smiles.
Yeah, it will be it'll have been a propaganda photo that they'll have made them take just to. They probably kept it in reserve in case they wanted to put something in the newspaper locally about look, they might have done this, but they're still being well treated, albeit they've been taken to prison. Who knows? Or they might have wanted to use it for other propaganda purposes.
So this Lensch, as far as you know, and I appreciate your research is still ongoing, and it's something I threw at you only yesterday. But do we think he might have been Gestapo or a policeman, or was he military?
I think he was. I can't pronounce it, but the German field police. I think it's likely he was one of those. But as I say, that'll be one for next month. We'll still be talking about Symes Nicolle, etc.
We will,
and all of these unfortunate people who were counted off.
Yes, and so
prison.
that was one of the batches of people that went, and also, and we don't know why they were split up. Possibly, maybe in something that there was only so much room on the plane, but also some were taken to sea. To France by sea via Jersey and St Malo, Granville, and then on to Paris. And this would have been Jessie Marryat's, which I'll remind you is Hubert's fiancée, Mr. and Mrs. Marryat. So they travelled separately to their daughter. Hilda Nicolle travelled separately to her husband, and Elsie Nicolle travelled separately to her husband. So they'd split the families up, which must have been incredibly disconcerting for them, on top of everything else. And then also there was Bill Allen, the groundsman that sheltered both James and Hubert when they were on the run in the cricket pavilion at your alma mater, Lismore College.
Yeah, at the college field.
Yeah,
there's actually a plaque up in the cricket pavilion there, recording the events of that and the bravery of Nicolle and Symes.
Okay, and also, and this is something I found very interesting, when James went to stay with his girlfriend Mary Bird, he also went via a farm near the airport and was assisted in some intelligence gathering by the Mansell family. And the Mansell family, two of the brothers,
Tom and Dick.
Tom and Dick, and Tom didn't really have that much to do with it, but he took his brother's place and said, "I'll go," and he was deported with the other people. There was an interesting story that came, I think I found it in the Commando Who Came Home to Spy, that when the Germans turned up at the farm to take Tom away, one of the Germans was a German Canadian. Do you know this story, Nick?
I didn't know.
No, what happened is that this chap was a Canadian by German birth, had gone home to visit family, and the German authorities wouldn't let him leave, so he eventually found himself in the Wehrmacht. And he obviously spoke fluent English with an American accent, Canadian accent, and said to Mansell, you need to take some really, really warm clothing where you're going, and basically said to him, make sure that you're well prepared for where you're going. And that was an interesting story. We often come across these. I think in Band of Brothers there was a small episode of a German soldier talking to one of the chaps in the airborne about the fact that he'd come from Chicago. I think it was Chicago, and he'd gone home to Germany and wasn't allowed home.
It wasn't that uncommon actually that happened. Interestingly, we're talking about the Mansell brothers. You're right, Tom just basically covered for Dick.
Yes.
He just didn't let on, despite being questioned.
I think the basis being that he just got married and they had a baby, etc.
Exactly, and so Tom just kept Dick out of the whole thing completely, which I think is an incredible thing to do, because the story, we mentioned it last month briefly, that these people were all interrogated, trying to keep the story up that the Symes and Nicolle had arrived 3 days previously, when in fact they'd been here for 7 weeks. Was it was very difficult with all of these people being interviewed at different times, and questions thrown at them, and the Germans saying, well, we know this is true or whatever, and so they think the game's up, and just keeping that story going was never going to work. So the fact that Tom managed to cover for Dick was just amazing in my view.
Yes, and we must stress the fact that these people were being taken into the unknown with fears of execution, etc. It was, in some ways, I don't really think the Germans knew what to do with them. Basically, it's like punish them, but it wasn't, I don't think, that clear in the mind what they were going to do. And this will be a story that reaches culmination in our December episode. But I must say that in addition to these people that were taken for assistance, they also took government officials. H.E. Marcon, who was the state supervisor, the most senior civil servant, he was taken over to France, and most notably Ambrose Sherwell, who was Her Majesty's Attorney General and President of the Controlling Committee over here. And his story, which we follow up on in December, really was quite, I'll say interesting. But he suffered a legacy, really, of this, but which we'll get into next month.
And
so,
it's if you listened to the August 1940 episode, he got a bit of flack, criticism, for making a speech on the radio, which was broadcast by the Germans. We go into the reasons in that episode, but there were good reasons for doing so. If you want to go back and listen to that one, you'll find out. But so he was criticised for that. Yet then he's assisting these commandos, and it's not the first time that he's assisted commandos that were stuck in the islands either. He's really sticking his neck on the line, knowing that he could be taken away and shot. So it really does annoy me when people say, he was collaborating with the Germans, and it's just not the case.
No, and he had a son in the Royal Navy as well. So
absolutely,
he had serving a son. Okay, so this is something that we will continue. It's very much an ongoing story. It reaches culmination with a degree of tragedy next month.
One of the other things, actually, Keith, that's probably worth mentioning was that all the radios were taken away in November 1940 as a result of this.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes,
and the fine was quite extraordinary. If you were caught not handing over your radio, the fine was 30,000 Reichsmarks. Now that was the equivalent at the time of £3,125.
So that's £3,000 then
in 1940s money. So you can imagine that would be more than anybody was earning, in multiple years.
And you've got the value today as well.
Yeah, that quite shocked me when I went and got the value as at today. a couple of days ago when I did this, that would be the equivalent of £219,325.
Well, that's the weekly wage for a professional footballer.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Premiership football.
But there's just no way anybody would have been able to pay that.
No.
Now, I've not seen anybody get fined that amount, funnily enough, because they wouldn't have been able to pay it. I have seen plenty of records of people getting sent to prison because the alternative was 6 weeks in prison.
6 weeks in prison, yeah.
But that, I just find that I don't know, did they get the one too many noughts on there, or decimal point in the wrong place, mixed up with a comma?
Yeah, if ever a figure was plucked out of the air, I think it was that one. And we should remind people that in those days, the wireless was the be-all and end-all of entertainment in the home. There was obviously no television, and it was not only was it obviously were people able to get BBC News. It was in a way it was a sort of link to the UK where people's families were, and so it was news gathering, and also it was that link, emotional link, if I could put it that way, and of course entertainment. People would sit down for the evening and at least be able to listen to some light orchestral music or dance music at the time. And when the radios were suddenly taken away from the whole population, it left quite a void in people's lives. Much, if you can imagine, the equivalent now, I suppose, is if you lost your phone.
Yeah, absolutely. You just completely disconnected from what's going on in the outside world, apart from the official German line in the local paper.
Yeah, and as I say, just the sheer ability to sit down at night, listen to a bit of music and relax and read, and all of a sudden that's gone. I don't think people should underestimate how it affected people's lives, and we will see how that plays out again in the December episode. So I want to move on to a few things here, Nick, where, as I said before, for listeners, I do work in for museum service and get to meet people that are very interested in the occupation. Many people, perhaps some people listening to this podcast, feel the same, that although they were vaguely aware of the occupation, they weren't really sure what it meant to be living as a British person under German rule for such a long time. Questions not always about social affairs. They do move into military affairs. And I met this week Kester, and I think it was Ian from, I think they said, the Southampton area. One of the things that Kester asked about, Nick, is, generally, why did the Germans come here in the first place, and why were so many here? Explain whether there was any strategic reason to be here. I mean, what was the point of them being here?
There wasn't one. Realistically, yeah. There was not a good reason for them to come, other than propaganda, and their leader at the time got it into his head that he wanted to hold these islands, and actually they were talking about turning them into a holiday destination. Once the war had finished, once they'd conquered Britain, and it was seen as a stepping stone to that as well.
Yes, that's important. But coming here was just a progression from the French mainland to some British possessions, and then onto the south, at least southern England, and of course, Operation Sea Lion is often quoted, but Operation Sea Lion was discarded. When was that sort of finally discarded?
It was postponed in September. It was officially postponed numerous times.
Because they obviously never mounted any form of invasion of the UK. By now, November, Battle of Britain's over.
Yeah,
Battle of Britain is over. Blitz ongoing still, or coming towards the end?
No, that's still ongoing.
Yeah,
there's bombing of the UK. Still going on. Predominantly, there was bombing for quite a number of years anyway. But the whole thing was really propaganda. But he tied up so many men here. Now, that is another thing to think about. Is at the start of the occupation, these men were, very fit young professional soldiers. By the time you get to later on in the war, they're being replaced by I can't remember what the German for it is, but they're basically called like the stomach units. It's people who've been badly wounded and they've been nursed back to health, but they're not in fighting fit form. So a lot of those ended up here, and the men that were the fighting fit professional young soldiers got shipped off to places like the Eastern Front. So you ended up with different mix of the type of troops and Navy and Luftwaffe staff here at different times in the war, but it basically became one large prison of war camp because you had 30,000 men tied up, and you didn't need to guard it after D-Day.
No, and of course, doing some sort of peripheral research, many regiments, I suppose, or regiments, battalions, did end up in the Russian front meat grinder, and in some of them were actually completely wiped out, and or survivors had to be sort of refolded into other regiments and things. So again, some of the young men that turned up here in their prime, believing that they were heading their way ultimately towards London, died on the Russian front.
Yeah,
in the horrors of survival. Didn't hardly any German soldiers survived that and the captivity, all the captivity afterwards. But that's another story. But the other thing that I think we should get into as possibly a separate program, Nick, maybe a special, is the difference between the initial fortifications here on the island as what they became, and then of course the scale up to the Atlantic Wall, because the two things were completely different. But we'll get. I think that there's a bit of a special there.
Yeah, I'm sure we can do something on that.
So Kester and Ian, hopefully that answers your question. Really, there was no huge point in them being here. It was Hitler's desire. Once he realised he wasn't going to be able to invade Britain. I think that came to an end in June 1941 when they attacked the Soviet Union. But he maintained quite a force here, and we'll get on to the amount of concrete. A big love of Nick's. We will get on to the exact, well, not the exact, but we'll give you some scale about the amount of concrete poured on the island. Okay, so what else have we got, Nick, in terms of military matters here? We've got 50 military police arrive with a list of prescribed books. So this is banned books that they started to pull out of the libraries.
Yeah, they took away books from the libraries. That happened at various points during the occupation, but I think this was the initial wave of these books are all banned. You cannot have them. Yeah.
Okay. Also, an account of 4 airmen coming ashore at Pointefort. So this is on Guernsey's western coast. So what happened there?
So these guys had been shot down. They'd been in a dinghy at sea for 48 hours. They were shot down mid-channel. I haven't been able to find out exactly which aircraft it was. So I'm working on that at the moment. But yeah, they were shot down mid-channel. They were at sea for 48 hours in one of the dinghies. Now, if you've ever been to a museum in the UK and seen one of those dinghies, I wouldn't fancy 48 minutes in the channel in that dinghy. They're not very big. They don't look very robust. I'm a very good sailor. I don't get seasick, but I still don't think I'd fancy bobbing up and down in that. And so they were in a very bad way when they arrived at Pointefort. Now, they were looked after by some islanders. The ambulance came and took them to hospital. The ambulance driver actually nearly ran over some Germans because they were trying to stop the ambulance. And he was determined that he wanted to get them to the hospital because one of them in particular was in really bad shape. So they took them to the hospital after this ambulance driver had made the Germans scatter, which was quite a risky move on his part. And they took them to the hospital. It was only a few hours before the Germans turned up and basically took them away as prisoners of war. But at least they'd been able to get some treatment. Unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
One man died the next day.
So you're following up on this. If do we know that the 4 people that were in the dinghy were the whole crew of a plane, or 4 surviving at that point members?
Yeah, I don't know at the moment. This one doesn't feature on the memorial at the airport. So I think because it was shot down mid-channel, it wasn't shot down anywhere around the islands. They just drifted this way. So I'm working on trying to find out which aircraft it was.
Do we know the names of the?
No,
we don't know the names.
I don't know the names either yet.
No.
So it's proving a little bit tricky, but I will get there. It can take a bit of time. I'm sure the names are out there somewhere in the records, but I don't have the names at the moment. But again, it's something I started looking at reasonably recently.
Yeah, another rabbit hole.
Yeah, again, the ambulance driver was actually threatened with deportation, as was the man who kept their dinghy.
So, yes, that's an interesting point. So their dinghy comes ashore, no matter how big or small it is, and it's just abandoned. So what was the local doing? Well, presumably it was down on the beach or the shore area, and it was an area that wasn't mined. Yeah. So some good old Gern not going to look a gift horse in the mouth, goes
Absolutely.
along and appropriates the dinghy, and of course the feds come after him afterwards.
Yeah, to be honest, it could have been. I would imagine he probably picked it up thinking this might be useful later on, not to use as a dinghy, but to turn into other things. He could have been making alternatives to bicycle tyres or something like that with it, to or perhaps even using it as some form of puncture repair kit for the tyres on bikes and things like that. But it wasn't a great time for aviation around the Channel Islands. Well, particularly not if you were German in November 1940. I can only see in the records that there was just those RAF crew that we talked about just now that were unfortunate enough to be shot down, albeit not near the Channel Islands. But if you were in the Luftwaffe, you weren't having a very good time of it in the Channel Islands. Now, some of this is probably partly due to the fact we had relatively short runways. Some of these aircraft were fairly tricky to operate on those runways, but also there was a multitude of other things going on. They did have a bit of a habit of shooting down their own aircraft. Because they mistook them for other aircraft and things like that. So the first one on the 1st of November was a Dornier DO-17, which was from a long-range reconnaissance unit, and that crashed off of Jersey on a training flight near La Rocco Tower. They were trying to land at the airport, but they crashed there, and all full crew were killed, in fact. Then later on the 3rd of November, a Ju-88 crashed at Jersey Airport following a technical failure. None of the crew were killed. And then on the 5th of November, they had another a Bucker BU-131.
Never heard of that type of
airplane. Yeah, I've got a photograph of it which I can share on social media of that type of aircraft, so the listeners know what we're talking about. The parachute failed and the pilot died in that incident.
And then on the same day, a Junkers 88.
Yeah. That crashed at Jersey Airport was recorded as 40% destroyed, so that would have only been good for spare parts. And again, a couple of days later...
Only a couple of days later?
Yeah, Ju-52 crashed and overturned at Jersey Airport. Casualties were 20, mainly pilots who had finished a training course.
Well, they were on board the aircraft.
It's a transport aircraft, and it's the one that looks like it's made out of corrugated iron.
Yes, I know the one, like a shed. Yeah, shed.
Looks like a flying shed. Well, it was one of those. But there was another incident on the 19th of November 1940 when a Heinkel 111 from the Pathfinder squadron crashed following an engine fire. Now that crashed, for anybody who knows the islands around Guernsey, that crashed on Crevichon, which
is a big basically it's a big rock. It is an island.
It is an island.
Nobody lives there. It's
probably what 100 yards across, something like that, 100 meters across. It's just a big grassy lump, really, which is near Herm, next to Jetu, and it crashed there, but it had a full bomb load that exploded, damaged buildings on Jetu. Unsurprisingly, the crew of 4 were killed. There's actually a really good article that I've got a link to, which I'll put on the show notes and on our social media, which has some photographs and a bit more information about that. But there's some debate as to whether it had a problem from the start, or whether it caught fire during flight, or whether it was a victim of Brown Towers gunners. So again, for those of you who are not familiar, there's halfway between the island of Herm and Guernsey, there's an old fortification which is built there, Brown Tower, which
it's a 19th century, mid-19th century fortification on a rock, really.
Yeah, it's a bit like a Martello tower, that kind of thing. They had a couple of anti-aircraft guns on the top, and they certainly once or twice managed to shoot down their own aircraft. This may be another occasion where they did that and they got a bit trigger happy.
Yeah, friendly fire indeed. Okay, well, you've got a link there, Crevichon plane crash. Can you put that up on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Facebook?
There's a couple of links to do with this actually that have a bit more information and some pictures, and you can see where it crashed exactly. The person that wrote the article obviously did quite a lot of research into it.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're nearly at the end. So, usual parish notices. A plug for Island Fortress. Nick, if you'd just like to explain about your
you can
blog.
You can find the blog islandfortress.com, where you get various articles and things there. It's fully searchable, and I've tried to categorise things as well, so hopefully it makes it a little bit easier to find.
And Islands at War is available it's on every Monday on Gnet Radio, but the new show is fortnightly. So this show that we're recording now will go out on Monday the 29th.
Yeah, 29th. Yeah.
Yeah, at 7 p.m. And then it's quickly followed up in the sense that it goes on to Mixcloud, Gnet Radio's Listen Again service, and then we also platform it on
just about everything. Now I've mastered the technology. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, and you can get us on Audible as well, which is the
I didn't know that.
Amazon Music, just about. I think we're up to about 20 platforms now that we're on. Some of which I'd not even heard of.
Well, we thank you for listening, because we are, even though we say it ourselves, we're getting a following far beyond what we ever imagined. It's just two guys getting together once a fortnight and talking about the war. So thank you ever so much. You can get in touch with us via email if you wish, with questions or queries or any form of comment that's reasonable, at occupied@gnetradio.com. Gnet Radio is funded by Guernsey Arts, and we report back to them. They're very pleased with the podcast, and we in due course will have lots of information about the 80th anniversary. That's in 2025. It seems a bit early, but we are working towards that. Also, I've been invited to join the committee of the Channel Island Occupation Society, so I'm now on that committee. They have a website, and we will have a little bit more about the society, because we're always looking for members. It's a fantastic society to be part of. You can look up about our activities, which we hope to enhance as we get towards the celebrations, already the commemorations around the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Guernsey, which is May of 2025. Right, Nick, I think we'll start writing up December 1940, and we will get back to the listeners with that in a fortnight's time.
Indeed, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook as well at Islands at War.
Okay, so just needs us to say goodbye from me, Keith, and goodbye from
Nicolle here. Have a great evening if you're listening to this on Monday evening, or enjoy the rest of your day if you're listening at some other point on one of the podcast apps.
Yes, indeed. That's goodbye from Keith. We'll have a little bit of Jim to take us out. So have a great fortnight, and we'll catch up with you, as I say, in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.